So today we're going to be talking about the do's and don'ts of pruning crepe myrtles. So one of my favorite trees in Hampton Roads, I think one of Hampton Roads' favorite trees, obviously it is, you see them everywhere. They're absolutely stunning in the summer. They come in a wide selection. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But they come with a little bit of controversy, which is what we're going to squash today, is how to properly prune a crepe myrtle. Do you ever have to prune? What do you need to do if you need to control size? What do you need to do if you need to encourage more blooms? So we've got a lot to kind of go through. And I hope that the visuals that you'll be able to see here today will help you understand how to prune a crepe myrtle better. I know sometimes when I pull in, branches or even a crepe myrtle and prune it, it's hard to see and kind of get an understanding. So I'm going to try and use some images to show you how to properly prune a crepe myrtle and maybe squash a little bit of those myths or the M-word crepe murder. We'll talk about that as well. So super excited. Crepe myrtles are awesome. A lot of people call them the tree of 100 days because they can bloom for up to 100 days. They're absolutely amazing. That's over 3 months of blooms. And they're just so easy to grow. Once a crepe myrtle is established, they're extremely drought tolerant. They're very disease and insect, pretty much disease and insect resistant. I'm going to talk about a little bit of that at the end. But they're very easy to grow and they're very versatile. You can use them in a lot of different ways in the landscape. You can use them in groupings. You can create a grove of them. You can line your driveway with them, or you can use them as just a specimen. So there's lots and lots of different great ways to grow crepe myrtles here in Hampton Roads, and they love this area. So they're an amazing tree. They love full sun. Give them a nice bright sunny spot to grow into and pick the right one and you'll be ready to go. And so that's kind of where I want to start. Is the first thing I always tell people whenever I start talking about a pruning class is selection is key. It's the same that I learned in business school. I don't know if you all know this, but I'm a business major. I have studied horticulture and I've been working here for 20 years. And so I feel like I relate to our average customer very well because I know a little bit about a lot of things. And I've done a lot of them. And so I have hands-on practice. And so the one thing that I talk about a lot when talking about any plant is thinking about choosing the right plant. It's very important that we always are aware of the plant that we're choosing and how big it's going to get. And I think that's probably the biggest issue that people have with crepe myrtles and why we've kind of gotten into this crepe murder realm of where we have a tree that's maybe getting too big, we didn't plan on it growing this fast, those types of things. The nice thing about crepe myrtles is, one, you can see all of those gorgeous colors that they come in. Pinks, whites, reds, and purples. I mean, the range in pink I absolutely love. From all the way to dark watermelon pink with the Tuscarora to all the way to a light kind of clear pink with the Hopi is one of my favorites. And then of course the purples, you get some mauve, the lilac purples, the Muskogees, and then the dark purples of the Hopi, of the Zunais and different ones like that, Catawba. And then the dark red of Dynamite or Red Rocket, and then the whites, which are Acoma and Natchez. There's a huge selection out there, and there's a huge amount of varieties. And I'm not going to go into that because I could spend an entire webinar talking about just the different varieties and the sizes and shapes. But the important thing is size. They grow anywhere from 2 to 5 feet as a shrub, and then you get like kind of the mid-range size. So that's kind of like the starting point is about 2 to 5 feet. And then you'll get some that get about 7 to 12 feet, 7 to 13 feet, somewhere in that range. So you've got kind of the dwarfs are your shrubs. Then the semi-dwarfs are going to be in that 7 to 13 foot range, which is a great little small tree. And then you've got your regular crepe myrtles that can go anywhere from 15 to 30 feet. I've seen some massive ones. And so those are typically the ones that I love. I mean, they're gorgeous. They put on a show. And if you've got space, that's the one you want. And they grow fast. And I think a lot of people get stuck in that scenario where I want it to grow fast, but then they don't realize, 5, 6, 10 years down the road, this thing's going to be 25 feet tall. And that's where we get into the pruning issues. So selection. It's extremely important to think about the trees that you're going to plant and how big they're going to get. Now, if we're going to prune, then when do we prune? Well, right now is a great time. So late winter into early spring is a great time to prune your crepe myrtles. And I'll explain why. So what happens in a tree, and I'll keep it real basic, is the sap in the tree. It's like blood in our veins. If we get cut, then the blood scabs up and it heals. And that is what a tree does. The sap is its blood, basically. It's carrying the nutrients up and down the tree. Well, in the fall, going into winter, the sap is lowering in the tree. It's storing into the root system, it's developing root system. That's why we always talk about when you plant something, fall is a great time to plant because that's when the sap is going down to the root system and establishing root growth. But then in the spring, as we start to warm, so as we start to get some nice sunny days and we start to see, the signs of spring coming up, the sap will start to rise. And that's why it's a good time to prune, because it's not full flowing, it's not middle of the summer, which is okay. We'll talk about that here in a minute. But right now, the sap is rising. It can heal off those wounds. There's not a lot of insect or disease issues in these colder time frames. So late winter to early spring. And here in the Hampton Roads area specifically, it's going to be somewhere around mid-February, so Valentine's Day, all the way to about mid-March. You've got a good amount of time to kind of prune. So you've got about a month here that you can really get your pruning done if you decide that you're going to prune. And so right now is a great time, late winter to early spring. All right, so this is where we kind of talk about should I prune or should I not prune? We talked about selection, right? So if you have the option to select your Crepe Myrtle, then that's great because you can pick the right size and you will only have to do some selective pruning, which I will talk about here in a minute. But a lot of us here in Hampton Roads, as we all see, they're all over the place, right? So a lot of us buy homes or a lot of us live in areas that have Crepe Myrtles already. And maybe it wasn't your option to select it and we need to do something about it and manage the size or control it or fix problems. And so we're going to talk about that as well. So if we ever have issues where we've got an established Crepe Myrtle, we don't want to get rid of it, we just want to train it properly, that's what we're going to kind of fix today. So the question is always to prune or not to prune. Should we even prune our Crepe Myrtles? Well, yes and no. It depends. It's really kind of your personal preference. They do take to pruning perfectly fine. It's just there's some bad things that we're doing sometimes to the Crepe Myrtles when we're pruning them too hard, and we're going to talk about that here in a minute. But I like this image right here because it shows a great example of a tree that really probably hasn't been pruned very much. This looks to me like it's a Natchez. It's probably not an Acoma. Acomas are typically a little bit smaller. But this is a Natchez most likely, or a white variety with those big long shoots of growth that kind of creates that umbrella habit. Gorgeous tree. But you can see down at the bottom, there's a small branch that comes off. It kind of shoots off to the side, so that probably hasn't been pruned. It doesn't need to be pruned. Now, there's a sidewalk there, there's a road, maybe somebody wants to park a car there, so we might be doing some limbing up on it. So even though we're talking kind of specifically about what we all see in the area of people really kind of cutting Crepe Myrtles hard, sometimes they don't need to be pruned. And so it's kind of personal preference. So I really love this next image because this is great. This is a Crepe Myrtle growing naturally. So this is what Crepe Myrtles look like. I mean, I really classify them almost as large shrubs. They can get huge, and naturally, pretty much any tree is going to grow with branches all the way down to the ground. That's how they naturally grow. It cools its root system. I always think about magnolias. You think those big broadleaf, leather leaf, southern magnolias, the baby gem or the little gems, and even the southern magnolias, the big guys. Those naturally should grow all the way down to the ground, the branches all the way to the ground. We all hate those magnolia leaves, right? They don't biodegrade. They kind of get everywhere in your yard, and they're a pain to rake up. Well, naturally, it should mulch itself, and that's what this Crepe Myrtle is doing. It's just growing naturally. It's got branches down to the ground. It looks like a big shrub. That's how most trees would look. Now, what we think a tree looks like is it's got a trunk and that nice lollipop top, but that's not how trees naturally grow. Crepe Myrtles grow as a large shrub, and we're the ones that turn them into trees. Now, it's not saying that that's a bad thing. I actually like the look of a kind of Crepe Myrtle with those gorgeous trunks, and you get to show them off. It's amazing looking. So this is just a good example of what it would look like if you just let it naturally grow. And I think that helps put into perspective what we're going to be talking about and how, you couldn't have this growing in your front of your house. You'd like to be able to see your house. You'd like to be able to, have some yard space, and limbing up Crepe Myrtles is perfectly fine. And we're going to talk about how to do that. So let's say we've decided, right? We're going to prune our Crepe Myrtles. Well, you need some tools to prune your Crepe Myrtles. And so I'm going to show you a couple tools here that I would recommend you having for a project like this. So, of course, the first thing is a pair of bypass pruners. Bypass pruners is kind of the quintessential thing that every gardener needs. And so we carry lots of different varieties here. I have Felcos. We've got, all the way from the best type all the way to an inexpensive type. So these are $14.99. It's a great little pair of pruners. I love the bright colors because if you leave them in the yard like I do sometimes, I've got a bunch of these around because sometimes I'll leave them outside. My Felcos I keep safe. I use those when I'm doing kind of big pruning projects, but it's always nice to have a couple handy pairs around. Now, bypass pruners are going to be like scissors. So they're going to kind of cross, whereas an anvil pruner, which I would show you, but I don't sell anvil pruners, and that's how much I don't believe in them. Anvil pruners have their place. More in, even a lot of florists use them. You can use them to prune dead wood is perfectly fine. But the problem with anvil pruners, it's literally an anvil on one side and a scissor on the other side, and it smashes. So it smashes a lot while it cuts. Bypass pruners don't smash very much. It does have a slight anvil side, so it's got a flatter side that's not sharp, and then it's got the blade side that's really sharp, and it bypasses the other one just like a pair of scissors. But a pair of bypass pruners are going to come in really handy when you get out there to go pruning. So if you don't have a pair, you got to come in and get a pair. We got plenty of them. Now, even a step up on your bypass pruners would be ratchet pruners. So ratchet pruners are a little bit bigger, and what they do is ratchet, and so it's hard to show because I didn't bring a branch in. But basically what happens is as you put it in and you're kind of in halfway through a branch, let's say, then you can actually pull this back out and get a little bit more torque. So these will actually stay closed, and you can pull this out and get a little bit more torque to kind of get through it. So basically it gives you the torque power that my next tool is gonna have, but in your hand. So having a pair of ratchet pruners is a good idea. But lopping pruners are one of my favorites. So I grabbed this one because, hey, look, two of my favorite tools right here in this combo kit. You can't get a better deal than that. But having a pair of lopping shears is really important. Basically, exact same thing as a bypass pruner, except it's got a larger head on it and gives you more torque because you got these handles to work with. So a bypass lopping pruner is what you want, especially for crepe myrtles, because we're going to be probably taking off maybe some sizable pieces of branches and trunks and stuff like that. So bypass pruners are a must, and bypass loppers are a must. Now, a lot of us probably have these guys laying around. These are not for this job. I brought them in to specifically say you don't need these when you're pruning a crepe myrtle. Now, maybe if you've got a shrub like Pokemoke or some of the Razzle Dazzle or some of the smaller series of crepe myrtles that you're growing as a shrub, then you can round them off pretty easily. But that's really what these are for, is shaping boxwoods or topiaries, just kind of getting a shape, and you're just taking off light growth. So long scissors basically to allow you to shape things. You're not going to need that in the winter for pruning your crepe myrtles for the most part, unless you're dealing with a smaller one that you're just shaping in size. And then my last tool that I absolutely love is my foldable saw. This is a kind of go-to for me. It's a must. I have bow saws, I've got chainsaws, and you might need some of those things. We'll talk about that here in a second. But this is one of my favorites. It's called a foldable saw. It's made by Terra Verde. It is absolutely amazing because you can fold it and put it in your pocket. So if you happen to be using a ladder or you just need it handy, you can put this in your pocket. You're not going to hurt yourself, and then just kind of like a pocket knife, you fold it out and you can prune. And this is very sharp, actually. It works really, really well. Over time, you might need to get a new one. These aren't super, super expensive, so you don't have to worry about that. I've probably gone through about 4 or 5 in the past 15 years. So they don't last an extremely long amount of time, but they're great. And you can get really, really nice ones of these as well. Even Felco makes a type of foldable saw. But this is a great little handy one to have. You might need a bow saw and you might need a chainsaw. So just to review real quick, lopper pruners, they're going to cut through some of the bigger wood. So they're going to be up to about 2-inch diameter. The way I kind of like to explain this is, a quarter and a silver dollar. Probably a lot of us don't even know what a silver dollar is anymore, but a silver dollar is, roughly 1.5 inches to 2 inches. And so the bigger coin size wood is where you're going to want a lopper shear, a lopper pruner. And then a bypass pruner is going to be up to about 1 inch diameter. Now, it depends on how nice your pruners are. Something like these inexpensive pair, you might get through 1 inch. Something like the Felcos, I've gotten through 2, maybe even 3 inches with my Felcos. So it depends. And then your saw is going to be up to you how big you want to try and get through, but typically 4 to 5 inches, somewhere in that range, is what you're going to use your foldable saw for. So those are your kind of go-to tools when we decide that we're going to prune. Now, what you might also need is a pair of gloves. it's a great idea to wear a pair of gloves, especially when we're using sharp tools and we're working with branches that could cut you and tools that could cut you. So wearing a pair of gloves is definitely a great safety feature. You might need a ladder if you're planning on getting up into a tree, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. You know, I usually like to prune them while they're small, and when they get big, I kind of let them go and be natural, and I'll just work on the areas that I can get to. But getting up on a ladder sometimes might be necessary. Just be very, very careful, be very cautious. You know, it's always better to just kind of take your time, and if you feel like the project's out of your realm of abilities, then don't do it. You might also use a pole pruner. Pole pruners do come in pretty handy. A lot of pole pruners, this one you can't quite see on that image, but they're gonna have a bypass lopper. That's what that cord's there for. You pull that, it's got a bypass lopper, but it's also got a saw on it, which is really, really helpful. Now that is not a great prune job that you're seeing there. You can see it's ragged, it's jagged. We'll talk about how you can kind of not do that as you're pruning, but pole pruners might help you get to some higher branches that you couldn't otherwise get to. So those are some of the tools that you might need. And then of course, a chainsaw. You know, you might consider if you want to use a chainsaw if you're doing some major cutting or if you're just comfortable using a chainsaw. Might be another thing. And then there's lots of different types of saws that you can use. So the next thing that we're going to talk about is what are we pruning for? So now that we've got our tools, if we didn't have the chance to select the right crepe myrtle for our yard and we were given one when we purchased our home or it was in the yard already and we don't want to get rid of it, we love it, we just need to encourage some different things. So one of the reasons that we might prune a crepe myrtle is for larger blooms. Now, what I want to talk about here is this kind of image here, this kind of trifecta of images where on the top, on that big image is a crepe myrtle that has been pruned. That is actually a pretty good job of pruning. Now you're going to see lots of images of different types of ways that we've pruned crepe myrtles over the years, but that is actually not bad. And that is probably a little bit of a control on the size, but really probably more to encourage bigger blooms. Now, what I'm talking about here is crepe myrtles bloom on new wood. So when a crepe myrtle blooms, it's going to bloom on this year's growth. And so what that means is if you prune it back, typically you're going to get stronger growth from thicker wood. Now, if we get into too thick a wood, we're going to run into problems. We'll get in that here in a minute. But you can see in that picture where the new growth is starting to come out on the crepe myrtle, how it's coming out nice and flush. It's not coming out crazy bushy. It's coming out nice and easy. And those are some good sized branches. That's actually where I would prefer the branches to be cut, is somewhere around a 1/2 inch to 1 inch diameter. That is the best practice. Now, as these trees get bigger, it might be harder, or we might need to control size. We're going to get into that. But pruning crepe myrtles will actually encourage larger blooms. So it's not a bad idea to prune your crepe myrtles. And really what I'm talking about here is a tip pruning, which I'm going to show you in a second. But you can see that image of that crepe myrtle with those huge blooms. That's a great looking crepe myrtle, and that's what you get when you prune properly. So this is what I call kind of tip pruning or pruning last year's growth. It's not the most amazing image in the world, but it gives you a great example of where it's been pruned, and then you can see the new growth coming off of it. So if you look at figure A, that's unpruned. Now you can see it's been pruned over the years. It's probably got 1, 2, 3, 4, 3 or 4 prunes on it already. But what it's showing you in figure B is to take those 2 pieces of new growth that you had last year and cut them back. And I usually say cut them back somewhere about 30 to 50%. I typically try not to prune it back harder than that. 50% for a crepe myrtle is perfectly fine. Most plants, I'm always going to say use the rule of thirds. Don't prune more than 30% or 33% or a third of the plant back. Because it can really hurt it. Now with a crepe myrtle, it's not going to hurt it. Crepe myrtles are extremely resilient plants. I'm going to say that a lot because as much of the bad pictures that we're going to see here, crepe myrtles are resilient. They last a long time. They grow for many, many years. And it's really hard to actually kill a crepe myrtle. In fact, if you've ever tried to cut one down to remove one from the yard, you probably have realized that they're going to continue to try and grow around your yard through its root system or back through the trunk that you cut it from. So you can see there, and then in figure C kind of shows the entire thing tipped off. And what we're talking about there is just pruning back some of that weaker wood or just cutting off the seed pods. It's as simple as just doing a little bit of pruning will encourage more growth, thicker growth, and better blooms. So hopefully that helped you a little bit. Now, when we prune, how are we pruning? We need to talk about proper prune angles. I like this image here because it shows you some good ones, but a lot of bad ones too. So First of all, I always like to prune at a 45 to 60 degree angle. It doesn't have to be super scientific, doesn't have to be perfect. You just want to prune at an angle. And by pruning at an angle, what that does is eliminates what you see on that top, where that flat top is right there. Now what happens when you prune, and sorry, this is not a crepe myrtle, but I love this image because it shows you a lot of bad things that you can do, but a couple good. So those two that are facing us are good angles. And what that means is if a water droplet falls on that angle, it's gonna fall off. And water is typically what spreads diseases. A lot of fungus and airborne viruses can get in when it's pruned flat and the water can sit on there or just rot. So if you've ever seen like a hole in a tree or where a tree has been catching water and holding on to water, that water can rot that tree. And so by having that flat cut on the top, it's gonna hold moisture longer than something that's like on an angle. Think of a roof. You know, the roof of your home is angled so that the water can run down to the gutters. So you wanna prune on an angle so the water runs off. Now, what I also want to talk about here is what they shouldn't have done here, which is they pruned and left a stub. Now, if you're pruning a branch off, which we might do, you want to prune pretty close to it. Now, if you go look up images or if you've ever taken a horticultural class, you've probably seen a lot of diagrams or different pictures drawn of the tree collar and where you shouldn't prune into the tree collar, and that is a very true thing. So if we're talking about oaks and maples and different plants and trees, not pruning into the tree collar, that is a very important part, and you shouldn't do that. Now, crepe myrtles don't typically form a tree collar, at least not at an early age. And if you don't prune crepe myrtle back all the way to flush with the trunk, then you're gonna have issues. And I'm gonna show you that here in a second. So you can see those stubs. If you're trying to eliminate that branch, cut it all the way off. If you leave that stub, it's gonna try and regrow from there. But I wanted to show you that for some angles. Now this is what happens when you don't prune flush. So when I talk about pruning crepe myrtles, you can go pretty close to that main trunk or that main stem that you're going back to. What I will always say, and you'll probably hear me say it 5 more times today, is take your time. You can't put it back on. So prune a little bit at a time and then make a final cut when you know that you kind of have made that decision. And especially when they're small and we're doing limbing up or shaping, hold the branch, kind of pull it away a little bit, see what it would look like without it. And once you've decided to take it off all the way back to the main trunk or the main stem. Now, a lot of crepe myrtles are going to be multi-trunked trees. We don't typically recommend a single trunk crepe myrtle because they have such a huge canopy that they actually are stronger trees with multi-trunks. And we're gonna talk about that here in a little bit. You'll see a better image of that. But this is what will happen if you don't prune flush to the trunk or to that main branch. You're gonna get some wild growth coming from an area that you're trying to eliminate branches from. So now you can fix this. Just go in, cut it a little bit closer to the trunk, it'll heal back over. Sometimes on an older tree like this, you can see some of the knobs on there, and you'll just have to make a flush cut, let it seal off, and then that way you don't get this kind of almost suckering growth coming from the middle part of your tree. Now, if we're limbing up is an important part of this because that first picture that I showed you, that really natural looking tree, that big one out in the open that can just grow naturally, that's kind of what's happening here. Now, what you are probably going to want to do is you want to turn it into a tree, right? We want to see that trunk. We want to be able to walk under it in the future, and we're trying to really force energy into the top portion of that tree. And right now it's putting energy into the lower portion. Now this is a really easy practice and it's really fun. I actually get a lot of enjoyment out of it. Be careful though, because I have found myself a lot of times just rolling and all of a sudden I've gotten to the top and I'm like, oh man, I've got a little tiny top and I've got these big trunks, because you just kind of have fun with it. I love pruning. It puts me in kind of a zen kind of feel and kind of lets me zone out and have a little meditation time to myself. But all you're gonna do here is just eliminate some of those lower branches. So it's pretty simple, and start at the bottom and work your way up. Take some breaks every once in a while, stand back, look at it, see if you want to go a little bit higher, and you're just trying to keep it at the same level. So we don't want one side to be a little bit lower than the other side, so we're just eliminating some branches off all the way to the trunk. So make sure you get them all the way to that main stem. Pretty easy thing. Now, when you're doing this, what you might see is this, which are suckers. And I think a lot of us, if we've ever grown a crepe myrtle, we've probably had issues with suckers. And I love the name because sometimes you want to say, I hate those suckers. But suckers are basically the tree trying to grow in its natural form, which is extremely multi-trunked and has a lot of shoots coming out of the base. Now, the good news about suckers is, let's say you lost a stem or something, maybe it broke in a storm. If you get sucker growth, you can retrain that into another trunk. But a majority of the times, and in this image you can see there's 3 trunks. I always like my trunks to be in odds if possible because you love odds in the garden and in the landscape. And so if you see odd number trunks, you might want to keep it that way. And so you're probably going to want to eliminate these guys. And it's not easy sometimes. Now when it's young like this, you can almost hand pull them. But what I like to do is usually get in there with a pair of hand pruners or those lopping pruners and get down in there and try and get them below the surface as much as possible. Now they do come back. They are a pain, but eventually you'll pretty much tackle the problem, and especially if you get them early. If you keep on it, you'll eventually get rid of them, and hopefully they never come back. Now they do sell products like sucker stoppers and different types of products that will help inhibit the growth in that area, but that's basically all it is a growth inhibitor. It's not going to kill it. It doesn't hurt the tree. It just stops that section from growing as aggressively. And so it's a fairly expensive little product. We do carry it, so if that's something you want to try, it's not a bad option, especially if you just don't have the time to deal with it. But I do recommend pruning them regularly, and cutting them as low as you possibly can. Try and even get underneath the ground. Even if you feel like maybe you're cutting a root or cutting around a root, be careful, but on a younger tree, be careful that you don't cut one of its main roots. But on an older tree, you can pretty much get down there and just try and get it below the soil level if at all possible. If they're coming up from around the base of the tree, you just got to keep them shaved off as much as you possibly can. I like to get them when they're real young because you can just go and just kind of almost like brush them off with your hands or just pick them off by your hands. So suckers are a pain, but you can definitely deal with them. All right. So then we've got, so now I just want to kind of go through an overview of what we've kind of learned so far. And I love this image because it shows you kind of a before and after kind of meshed into one. And so what you've got here is that dark brown color. The dark brown stems are going to show what you're going to leave behind and not touch. And then that lighter color is things that you're going to eliminate. And the reason I like this is because it's hard with an image sometimes, or even just here, just to show you what crossing branches look like. Now you can see it down there in the bottom where the trunks are coming up. You can see some suckers. We talked about that, eliminating that. We're going to try and limb this up, get the habit up and high, so we'll eliminate some of the weaker, younger inside growth. And then crossing branches. So crossing branches or rubbing branches are really not great for a crepe myrtle or really any tree or plant because those are going to cause constant friction. When they move in the wind, those branches are constantly rubbing and it's going to create issues and affect the flow of nutrients up and down through the tree. So it's really important to eliminate those if at all possible. Now this is pretty significant. This has 5 trunks, so you would think, hey, this is great, and you could probably leave them. Because let's be honest, we know that as trunks grow, they might grow into each other. My mom has a huge crepe myrtle in her backyard, and it's basically a single trunk now. Now, it was probably originally 70 years ago, 60, 70 years ago, it was probably originally a multi-trunk tree. And over time, those trunks have just gotten more and more wide, and they've grown into each other. That's natural, that's fine, that's not an issue. And this is probably what would have happened to this tree. But we want to get it a little bit more open in the center, which is something that I haven't brought up yet, which is very important. So and you're going to see that in one more image here. But we want to open up the center, allow sunlight in, allow good airflow, eliminate crossing branches, eliminate weak wood, and get it back to kind of a simple structure and something that is appealing to our eye. So I hope that helps. Now, this is where we get into a gray area, into the tricky area, and into the crepe myrtle. And I'm sorry that this image isn't the most amazing image in the world, but I want to show you kind of some bad things that are done here, but also some good things that can come of this. Now, controlling size is a hard one because a lot of people are going to say, shouldn't cut back a crepe myrtle real hard. But sometimes it might be a necessity. If we've got a 30-foot tree and we love the tree and we don't want to remove the tree, we don't want to cut it down, but it's just too big. It's running into our house. We've got issues with it, and it just needs a reset. I think that's a great way of kind of putting this, is we need to do a reset on a large tree. So it's 30 feet tall. I can't handle this size anymore. I've got issues. It's got issues. We need to correct them. We need to do a reset. So pruning it back hard sometimes is not the end of the world. And we can fix it because we've learned now how to prune it properly. So when we've done this, now as it regrows, and I'll talk a lot more about this, how to kind of correct that. Now what I don't like about this, and hopefully you've learned this and you probably already have recognized it, the flat tops. All of those straight, horizontal cuts are going to collect a lot of moisture. So here in this, the only thing I would have recommended is to cut it at an angle. So if you can cut it at an angle, then you won't hold water. So this is a great way of controlling the size. Now this is not as extreme as some people might take it, which is going to be all the way down to almost the nubs of the ground. Let's say 2 or 3 feet from the ground. But this is a way to control the size. And so by doing this effectively and kind of cautiously and taking your time with it and realizing that from this stage, you've got more work to do. It's not just do this and walk away from it. We've got some work to do after we've done something like this, but it's sometimes, I believe, it is a necessity. And so if you need to do this, then we completely understand. Just learn from it and let's correct it and get it going in the right direction. So this is a great example of what to do and not to do. So the one on the left is obviously not a very good prune job. You can see a lot of the nubs forming where they've kind of probably pruned it in the same spot every year. This is getting closer to Crepe Murder to me. Now what you can also see is the trunk doesn't look real healthy. It's also got some crossing branches, a major crossing branch right there. There's a V on the left side of that image that has a shoot coming through it from another branch. And so those are crossing branches. This is not a happy tree and it's not going to perform extremely well. And it probably doesn't, which is why they probably keep pruning it. Now what I would do to this is try and give it a little bit of a reset. I would take some of those major crossing branches out, open up the center, get it back to a nice 3 to 5 good strong main stems, and then I would take them off below those notches that are formed. Now I know that's extreme, but from there we can correct it. Now the one on the right hand side that's just above my image here is a very well pruned tree. Now that one's open in the center, right? We can see through the tree. It's got a cool habit. That's a really cool tree to look at, and that's well pruned. Now some might say I don't want to prune it that hard, or I don't want to keep it, I don't want to prune into that thick of wood, and that's fine. But it just shows a good example of somebody that is maintaining the Crepe Myrtle. They've eliminated weaker wood from the inside. They've opened up the center, and that thing probably gets gorgeous blooms in the summer time frame and a nice big canopy, and that is a well pruned tree. So I think that's kind of what we're all aiming for, is kind of going for something more like that. Now, let's get into Crepe Murder. Crepe Murder is a tough one, right? So there's a lot of different types of Crepe Murder too. So I've always believed that this is Crepe Murder. And Crepe Murder is where you prune it in the same spot year after year. You see a lot of shopping centers doing this. So shopping centers want their trees to stay the same size. And the good thing about Crepe Myrtles, again, is they're resilient, they're tough. So they will last like this for many, many years. But to me, it's very unsightly to see something like that. And it's alarming to me to think that that is a good thing. Now, this is actually a practice that they still use in Europe, which is called pollarding or pollard. So pollarding is actually a practice that has been used for centuries. I mean, for a very, very long time. But it was used for a purpose. It wasn't to control the size of the tree. It was used to get those whips of new growth. So, in a woodland setting or an area where maybe you don't have a lot of trees and you've got a few trees that you can pollard. And pollarding is where you prune them in the same spot every single year and you get these whips of growth, but they were using them. They were using them to form baskets and fences and trellises and different types of things that they needed. And so it was done for a purpose. But if we're doing it to control the size of a tree, I don't feel like that's proper, and that's where I feel like it's Crepe Murder. And I think it's unsightly. And as you can see there, that tree's got issues. So where it's been pollard or pollarding, they're in that same spot year after year. You've got some blackness in there. There's a lot of open space there for disease and infection and insect issues, and it's just opening up the Crepe Myrtle to a lot of stress. And then what you will also see, and I think it's my next image, there you go. Now this is actually probably a very healthy Crepe Myrtle, but I wanted to show kind of what it looks like when you do that practice. When you cut it in the same spot every year, you're gonna get huge, weak shoots of growth. And what that means is they're gonna grow from there because it's trying to rebound. It's trying to say, hey, I'm trying to survive here. I need to put on some growth. And then it's trying to bloom, because why do plants bloom? Because they're trying to reproduce. They're trying to save their species. They're trying to kind of populate. And so they're blooming to form the seeds to allow new trees to grow. But in this case, you might see those long wisps of growth and then big blooms. And typically on a tree that's been pruned in the exact same spot year after year, Crepe Murder, pollarding, is that those growth shoots cannot support the size of the bloom. And so you get kind of this crazy looking habit, almost like a Medusa head, where they're just kind of flopping everywhere. And what also will happen is because that tree is stressed out, because we're putting it through something that it doesn't want to go through, then you're going to see that the sheen isn't going to be as good on that leaf, and you might see powdery mildew on that plant because it can't thwart off any disease, and you're going to have issues with it. And the more and more that we do it, the worse and worse it gets. So try not to prune in the exact same spot year after year. Now, the other form of crepe murder is just not thinking about what you're doing and just cutting it off because that's what you want to do. Now, the good news is all of these things we can come back from. So all of them we can come back from. And Ellen just asked a great question. When is the best time to cut old flower pods, and is it necessary to do it? It's not necessary to do it. You don't ever have to prune a crepe myrtle. And we're going to talk about that as we get kind of closer to the end. But you can do it throughout the summer, really, if you're just kind of pruning off, seed pods. You can even do a little light tipping then. But yes, if you prune off the seed pods, you'll get bigger and better blooms because they're coming from a stronger wood. But back to the crepe murder, this is where it's just thoughtless, and they just basically probably hired some company that just came through and buzzsawed them off. A lot of flat cuts, not a lot of angles. And then the picture on the left is a great example of what you're going to be dealing with if this is done. Now, if you do a size control, and we go back to that original picture and we show you kind of what a good size control looks like, where you can kind of rebound from it a little bit easier, this is going to take years and years to come back from. Good news, crepe myrtles are tough. They're going to come back. They're going to keep trying to grow, but you're going to deal with this picture on the left here, which is a lot of growth coming from a lot of different angles, and it's going to cause some disease issues. So typically what I would recommend as we kind of start to talk about how are we going to correct this issue is, what do we do from this point? It's starting to regrow. I've got this crazy bushy habit. I've obviously messed up, or I had to control size and now I've got this going on. So what do we do? Well, what you want to do even at this point would be to go in and thin some of that out, because powdery mildew is bound to exist in that plant because there's no airflow. It's got too much growth in too tight of a space, and so you're going to have issues. Insects will get in there and find a nice cozy home because there's no other insects that are going to be in there, no other predators that are going to get to them. So this is a bad thing, but it can be corrected. It's just going to take some time. So here's a great image. I love this image because it kind of shows you that somebody probably wasn't pruning these crepe myrtles properly, but they're trying to fix what they've done. And it's a great example of that because you can see some of the knotting and some of the stems that have been cut probably for years and years. But then you can see that the last prune that they did here was actually a really good prune. So they went and they took the 3 to 5 probably best shoots out of each trunk. So this is going to take some time and some thought, but go through and you can see all of those different tips. And then they cut those back. And they said, okay, now I'm going to start regrowing and going back and to what we originally said. So let me show you that image again of what the pruning of last year's growth. That's kind of the best solution if we can do that. So that I think kind of really describes what they're doing with this image, which is they're trying to correct the issues. And you've learned these things. We know that we don't want crossing branches. We know that we don't want some weak wood. We can take the seed pods off. We want to prune the new growth from last year about half. So you know the process now of how to correctly prune a crepe myrtle. So when we have a tree that has maybe been pruned incorrectly over the years, then we can start to correct those issues because now we know how to prune them properly. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is some of the different things, and then of course if we've got any questions we can ask them. A lot of people, these are things that people are bringing into us daily, or questions that we get a lot about, especially when we're talking about pruning, is pruning sealers. Now, pruning sealers, like this guy right here, and I'll show you some of these products here in a second, but pruning sealers I don't actually recommend. Pruning sealers, especially on a Crepe Myrtle, don't really work extremely well. Basically, it's like putting a permanent Band-Aid on a scab that we have. It's going to stay, it's never going to heal up. Let the tree heal naturally if it can on its own. It doesn't need a pruning sealer. It didn't have it, a billion years ago when trees started growing. So it doesn't need a pruning sealer. Now, we do sell them, so you might say, why do you have a can of it there? And I carry two different types. I carry the paint-on ones and the spray paint ones. Now, the reason I carry them is because if you prune something, you had to prune it, or it broke in a storm and you had to kind of make a clean cut on it during the improper time of the year, then we carry it. So a lot of those examples would be fruit trees, either whether it's fruiting or just flowering trees. Fruit trees get a lot of borers and different types of insects into the tree that are not good for them if you've got open wounds in the summer. So if you ever had that issue in the middle of the summer, then we would probably say, hey, we don't recommend this, but this is your best solution, is to seal up that prune so we don't have any insect or disease issues in the future. With Crepe Myrtles, you don't have to worry about that. They're going to heal up pretty quickly. They don't get a lot of borers. Now, I know the ambrosia beetle borer is an issue, and we can talk about that too, but typically you don't see a whole lot of that in this area. These are the three main ones. Do we use a pruning sealer? Not on Crepe Myrtles, but if you have a sunken area, if you have an area that's collecting water, or if something is cut at the improper time of the year, then that's why we carry it, because it's probably the best thing that you can do to kind of help thwart off any disease or insect issues. But also, if it's something that's holding moisture and it's just something that you can't correct right away, then that is something that'll seal that off a little bit and help protect the tree during any kind of those instances. So Jody asked a good question. What is the lichen stuff that grows on smaller branches? So lichen is a natural moss, actually, kind of fungi. I'm not 100% sure if it's a fungi or a moss, to be honest. But basically, it's a plant. It is a living plant, but it doesn't hurt the tree. Now, I've seen lichen get so bad that the tree doesn't bloom or produce very well. And in that case, that would be a great reason to maybe bring it back down a little bit and do a little bit of pruning to get some of the lichen off, and let it regrow new shoots that the lichen will slowly grow. Now, lichen also grows in very shady spots. So if your Crepe Myrtle's in a lot of shade, you might see more lichen. Now, doesn't mean that the Crepe Myrtle isn't providing its own shade for the lichen during the summer months. So it could be too shady, but lichen, typically, I've never seen lichen kill a plant. It's not parasitic necessarily, so it's not living off of the plant. It's not taking nutrients from the plant. It's basically rooted in a little bit, and it's hanging on, and it's collecting nutrients through rainfall and different debris and airborne things. So lichen really is not a bad thing. In fact, a lot of people, when they're stuck out in the woods and they're trying to find directions of where the true north-south is, you'll see on all the big trees, lichen is growing on the north side of the tree. So it's a great kind of survival tool there too. But lichen is typically not bad. You can see a little bit on that pruning sealer picture where he's spraying the prune there. You can see a little bit of that kind of green and that gray up there. That's probably a little bit of lichen, completely fine. But great question, because I didn't bring a picture of that, but that's a really, really good one. Now, the next one is powdery mildew below the spray bottle one, but below the pruning sealer. Powdery mildew is a big issue in this area because we have fluctuations in temperatures, we've got a lot of moisture, and moisture is the spreader of powdery mildew. The great news about Crepe Myrtles is they're pretty resilient, as I've mentioned multiple times here, and they're going to drop their leaves. I didn't mention this, but Crepe Myrtles are one of the last things to leaf out and one of the first plants to drop their leaves in our spring to summer to fall season. So in the spring, one of the last things to leaf out. In the fall, one of the first things to drop their leaves. So a tree of 100 days, the blooming tree of 100 days that blooms for 100 days is really only leafed out a little bit before and a little bit after it blooms. Pretty much the whole time that it's growing for us, it's blooming. So it's an amazing tree. So the good news is when those leaves fall, if you had a powdery mildew issue, rake those leaves up and dispose of them, put them in a garbage bag, get them out of there. I wouldn't recommend composting them if they're really bad, because sometimes you can store that and keeps it in your area, if anything. So go ahead and dispose of those leaves. Powdery mildew can be corrected. There's a lot of different ones. This is f-stop. I'm going to show you some of these here in a second as we wrap up. And then the worst one is this new one, and this is that Crepe Myrtle bark scale. And you might not even know what I'm talking about. And I could do a whole webinar on Crepe Myrtle bark scale. I'm not going to, but I just wanted to show you kind of an image of it. So if you've got Crepe Myrtles, I would suggest going out and looking at them, because this is going around and it's going to be a problem in this area. Started in Texas. A lot of garden centers buy a lot of plants from Texas, and it's just natural. And this is how insects and diseases spread. So it's a nature of the beast, unfortunately. But those little white dots in there are Crepe Myrtle bark scale. And scale in general is a insect that crawls very slowly up and down a tree and basically eats the tree. Now, a small infestation like this is not going to be hard to control, and it's not probably going to cause a lot of issues, but it is going to be hard to see, because a lot of time it gets into those nooks and crannies of the Crepe Myrtle, and you might not even notice it until all of a sudden it's exploded, and they can reproduce very, very quickly. And they produce a sticky substance that sometimes you'll find on the lower branches and leaves that looks like sap, and it's going to be sticky. It's called honeydew. It's basically what they secrete as they eat your plant, as they live off of your Crepe Myrtle. Now, the problem with that honeydew is it's sticky, and a fungus called sooty mold will stick to it. And now you've got a fungus and an insect issue. And so typically what happens is people don't realize they have Crepe Myrtle bark scale until it's too far gone, or maybe not too far gone, we can always save them, but until they start to see that black sooty mold on the branches. All of a sudden they'll come in and they say, when the leaves fell off this fall, all I see is black all along the branches. Well, most likely the culprit is this guy, the Crepe Myrtle bark scale. And so they're a problem. It's in this area. You're going to see a lot of it, and I'm going to show you kind of the ways to kind of cure that. So there's a lot of different information out there about Crepe Myrtle bark scale. We've got it in the area, and we've been dealing with it. So I wanted to show you a couple things if you've got it, how to kind of stage it off. This is a tree and shrub drench. This is an insecticide drench. It is going to go into the system of the tree, and it's going to cure your problems from the inside out. The nice thing about this is it's a drench, so you don't have to spray your entire tree. This is the exact same active ingredient, the systemic insect spray. Now, this is only going to last about 4 to 6 weeks, but it will create some contact kill, and it might not last as long, which sometimes is good, and I'll explain. So with this one, this is going to last somewhere around 8 to 10 months, maybe 6 to 8 to 10 months, depending on a lot of different scenarios. You know, environment, how much rainfall we get, all of these different things. But typically you're going to get a lot longer use out of this. Now it says it can protect up to 12 months, so it could be a yearly protection. So we want to be fairly careful with this one. I like to use this one in the fall, because right when the Crepe Myrtles are done blooming, then you can use this and it goes into the system of the tree and it lasts all the way until about summer. It's going to start to wane, and then you don't have to worry about the bees and the butterflies. Now, there is no exact science showing that this actually goes into the blooms and into the nectar of the Crepe Myrtle blooms, but we want to protect our local pollinators and our insects, and bees and butterflies do use Crepe Myrtle nectar, so it's important to kind of be careful about when you use this. But it is one of the strongest, and it's what the cooperative extensions are recommending, and different types of colleges that have done research on the Crepe Myrtle bark scale. This is what they're recommending, and this is one of the best ones. And this is an insecticidal drench. So you mix it in a bucket, depending on the size of your tree. It's got directions on it. Always read your directions. And then you're going to mix this in a bucket and just pour it right around the base. And that way it can get absorbed by the tree. Now another one, or that one that I like too, is this one. Exact same thing, doesn't last as long. So maybe you didn't realize you had it and it's spring and you want to get out there and spray it, and you want to use something strong like this, but you don't want it to last into the summer months. And this is a great option for you too. Gets an on-contact kill as well as goes into the system of the plant, lasts about 4 to 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks at the most. Now, horticultural oil is also a great option. Completely organic, completely safe. Now this works by suffocation. So if you've got the insects in there, you need to really get this in there. So I like to use this in the winter or the spring, or the late or early spring or late fall and winter, because the tree doesn't have any leaves on it and it's much easier to get a good coat of this. So this is a great option. So a question there from Francis is, will it work other trees as well? So yes, all of these are designed for plants. All of our plants. Now just be careful if you're using something like a systemic insect drench that you don't use it on a edible tree because it goes into the system. Any systemic products you don't want to use. But this is a great one to always have around. This would be in my cabinet at home. If I went home right now, I've got this in my garage and I've got it always ready just in case I need it. Horticultural oil works by suffocation. So you really need to coat the tree extremely well because it's going to prevent the insect and disease from breathing. So this is going to work on the sooty mold as well as the Crepe Myrtle bark scale. So this is a great option to have, and you can use this anytime. It's not going to hurt the bees and the butterflies. So this is a really, really good option. If you just use this, it's going to take you a long time to really get the problem under control. So by using something strong for a couple times might get you there a little bit faster, so then we can just use something like this. But Crepe Myrtle bark scale is going around. I just want to make you aware. We've got solutions. Come in and talk to our garden experts. They know a lot. Powdery mildew, this is a great one. F-stop lawn and garden fungicide. I love this one because it's got the hose-in sprayer. So a lot of our fungicides are a mix. You're gonna have to mix it with water. This one comes with a hose-in applicator, so you just attach it to the hose, spray down the tree. Powdery mildew is a pretty easy one to control. As I mentioned before, when the leaves fall off, then you just rake up the leaves, and that usually will cure the problem for next year. But using a fungicide during the season is a good option as well to kind of help stop the issue from spreading and getting worse. So that's really kind of a rundown of everything there. I hope this helped you understand how to prune them properly. I showed you a lot of images of ways to not prune them. I definitely recommend not pruning them in the exact same spot every year. I think that's the worst possible thing you can do. If we have a tree that we inherited, that we purchased a home, and we've got a control size, we can do it. Now you know the proper stages of once you've pruned it back, how to regrow it properly and how to prune it in the future years. What I don't want you to do is cut it down hard and then not touch it for 10 years and let it grow. It's gonna grow in a crazy shape. We gotta retrain it. So if you're gonna control the size of your crepe myrtles and you're gonna bring it down and you're gonna give it that reset that I mentioned, then take your time and realize that when you do it, it's gonna be a 2 or 3 year process before you get it back to the shape and size that you want and into that structure that you want. So it's an ongoing process, so be careful and make sure that you're prepared to kind of maintain and do that because it's going to be for the betterment of the health of the plant, but also for the look of the tree. It's going to look better if you take your time and you realize that it's going to be a couple times of pruning, a couple more years of pruning. Now, as I mentioned, you never have to prune a crepe myrtle. So if you want to let them grow naturally, let them grow naturally. That is perfectly fine. What you're going to see on a natural crepe myrtle, I didn't mention this, I don't think, before, is you're going to see some smaller blooms, but you're going to get hundreds and hundreds of them. So it's still a gorgeous tree. We have great examples here. If you shop with us here at McDonald Garden Center at the Independence store specifically, we have a ton of crepe myrtles here that we don't prune. And so right when you walk in, you'll see this gorgeous Natchez. We don't prune it ever. I mean, we've limbed it up over the years and we've shaped it a little bit, but we never prune it. It's huge and we love it and we don't touch it. So you're gonna see usually smaller blooms on it. You're not gonna see those gigantic blooms on it, but you're gonna see smaller blooms and a ton of them. So who cares, right? It's kind of personal preference. I always like, as a younger tree, to kind of get it to the size and get it to the shape and get it into the look that I want. I like to start early and do it as a small tree, and then as they get bigger, I let them go and let them do their thing. That's me personally. You can do what you want to do. I just hope that these techniques help you prune them properly and have a more successful, healthy, happy, prettier tree. So that's what my intention is today. So Irene said, when is the best time to prune? Right now is a great time. Mid-February to mid-March. Late winter into early spring. Best time to prune. Really, really good. When should you cut prune crepe myrtles? I missed that answer. Sorry, Ellen, I just answered it again. So definitely in the late winter to early spring. Now's a great time. Now, if we're doing small pruning, it's okay. Let's say a branch broke in a storm, or all of a sudden the branch is in the way of something else that you want to do, or every time you mow the grass in the summer, you're hitting this branch. It's okay to do one prune here and there. It's just when we're doing a reset prune, or we're doing a prune to eliminate weed growth, or we're doing a prune to eliminate rubbing branches, or any of these techniques I talked about, limbing up, sucker growth. Sucker growth you can cut anytime. But all of those things you can do little bits and pieces of it here and there. But if you're doing an overall pruning job, you want to do it right now, late winter into early spring. All right, everybody, let me scroll through and just make sure I got all the answers to all the questions. I didn't see a lot, which hopefully means that I covered a majority of them. Let's see. Good look. All right. Thank you. So thank you for the comment, Dewey. Good looking stream. That's what we're going for. Hopefully this is a new look that we can keep doing. We had a little bit of technical difficulties there at the beginning, but we will get that fixed. So Eileen, I think I answered your question about when to cut flower pods. You can really do that anytime. I definitely recommend, if you've got them on there and you can get to them, to do it in the winter months. As you're doing your normal prune, you're going to be cutting them off anyways, so it's a great time. But if it's a smaller tree, it will help them rebloom. I don't think I mentioned that. So plants bloom to seed, right? So they're going to be trying to form that seed. If you take the energy out of forming that seed and you put it, it'll put it back into forming more blooms. So if it's small enough that you can do deadheading in the middle of the summer, it's perfectly fine to go out there and do a little tipping here and there, cut off some of those seed pods, and you'll get more blooms. All right, I think I got everybody. All right, everybody. Well, have a great day. Yep, so it said perfect timing on this webinar. Yep, that's why we wanted to do it right now, because if you're planning on pruning or you're thinking about controlling size or any of these techniques, now's the time to get out there and do it. I hope you all enjoy this. So yeah, Karen just said, looked and saw several species of birds that eat the seeds. Yes, and that's true. So you don't have to do it. Once they get to that kind of dried up stage, or even where there's no seed pods on it, but you'll see a lot of that kind of that weaker growth. I don't know if I had that on any of my images there. Let's see if I can go back and just see if there was any image of a Crepe Myrtle. I don't think I had one that really showed. So here, this will be kind of the best example that I can probably show you, is when that bloom is done, it'll form a seed. It'll be green, it'll be hard, and then it'll start to dry and it'll open up, and that's typically when the birds will probably get in there and eat some of it. But even in the winter months, or about now, you might not even see any seed pods, but you're going to see a lot of that weak, kind of very fine growth that was holding the seeds. That is what I really want you to get off if you're able to do it. If you don't, it's fine, it's natural, it's going to be perfectly fine. But if you can prune that off, that weaker growth will allow bigger and better blooms to come from it. Someone told me that Crepe Myrtles choke themselves if you don't prune them. Where does that belief come from? I have never heard that, so that's a great question, Denise. I have never heard that they'll choke themselves. I mean, what I will say is over time, Crepe Myrtles might not bloom as well as they used to. The one in my mom's backyard that I mentioned earlier, it's probably been there for 60, 70 years. It is extremely old. It is super cool because it's got like all these knots and stuff in the bark where it's just kind of been growing over top of itself. But it's not dead and it doesn't bloom profusely. I probably could prune it back, but it's a monster tree. I mean, it's got to be all of 30 to almost 40 feet high and wide. It is a huge one. And so we just kind of enjoy it for the look of the tree and not so much for the blooms. I've never heard of it choking itself. Now, what you might be thinking, or what I'm thinking that could be, is that that it's maybe not blooming as well, or it's not performing as well. And that's kind of what we're talking about, maybe a reset, or maybe controlling or trying to help it bloom more. And there's a lot of things that we can do for nutrients. I didn't talk about that as well. There's so many different things as far as nutrients go. pH levels, they're pretty easy for pH reasons. They can grow in very acidic soil, which is what we have in this area, but maybe it needs a little bit of more phosphorus, maybe a little bit more potassium to help kind of protect it all around. So there's a lot of different things that we can do for it. I would definitely come in and talk to some of our garden experts here at the Garden Center if you have specific needs, and we can get you something like just straight phosphorus, or our bloom booster, or even our green leaf fertilizer, which is a great one. It's got trace elements, micronutrients that all of our trees need. So there's a lot of different things there that might help you with dealing with any of those smaller issues. I've never heard of a Crepe Myrtle choking itself. Now, of course, the roots could do that if they never were teased when they were brought together, or when they were planted. But sometimes that is where a lot of people might use the word choke, is the root system chokes itself out because it's just wrapping around itself. But I've never heard of that. So great question. All right, so I think, thank you, Mike. I'm glad you affirm. Great, that's awesome. So great, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Now you don't feel so bad for neglecting the tree. Denise, don't worry about it. The cool thing is Crepe Myrtles will thrive on neglect, and they'll thrive on if you want to prune it every year. So either way, they're very versatile, very easy plants to grow. And I hope you all enjoy this. We'll try and not use the M word as much anymore, and we'll just say now we properly know how to prune a crepe myrtle. So I encourage you, if you want to go out and do it. If you don't have to. So hopefully you learned a lot. I hope you all have a great day. Enjoy this warm spell that we're having, and we hope to see you here in the garden center pretty soon. I'll be back next week to talk all about birding. So that'll be a fun one. Also very timely. Time to get your bird feeders out, get them cleaned up if you haven't had them out already. Get your bird houses ready, pick out your seed, and get ready to attract some birds into your backyard. It's a lot of fun. I've been enjoying it all winter long. So definitely check out our birding webinar next Thursday, new time, Thursday at 11 a.m. So everybody have a great time. I'll see you next time.